In 1956, 2 letters and a phone call from abroad mattered more to the British Empire than a century of battles. Within days, a secret invasion plan unraveled, not at the front, but in the markets, and the empire's mask slipped. What collapsed at Suez was not a military gamble, but the illusion that old empires still called the shots. Currencies, oil routes, and global opinion now moved faster than fleets. In the vacuum, 2 new capitals, Washington and Moscow, began deciding whether European armies stayed or went. From the League's mandates to Ghana's independence, from India's partition to the Congo's crisis, we follow a chain of consequences that Suez let loose. Decolonization was not a slow fade, it was an accelerated reckoning, where the power of markets, movements, and media replaced the gunboat. The empires fell, but the world they built still frames our lives today. Between 1880 and 1914, European capitals turned overseas expansion into a competitive sport. Britain, France, Germany, Belgium, Italy, and others treated maps like balance sheets, each new color patch a proof of strength. The scramble for Africa moved from coastal forts to the interior at record speeds as treaties, rail spurs, and flag-raising expeditions turned vast regions into units to be governed from afar. Factories in Manchester, Lille, and the Ruhr, hungry for palm oil, rubber, cotton, and copper, needed dependable sources. Steam mills and assembly lines pumped out textiles, guns, and metal goods in volumes that outpaced home demand, so markets overseas looked essential, not optional. Politicians linked this to national pride. A larger empire meant more contracts for docks and shipyards, more tonnage under the national flag, and more leverage in diplomatic crises. Newspapers helped turn distant conquests into domestic theater, treating colonial governors and explorers like sports stars whose wins signaled national vigor. To prevent European wars over this rush, leaders convened the Berlin Conference in 1884 to 1885, where ambassadors codified effective occupation and penciled rivers and lines across African interiors. Not a single African representative sat at the table, while delegates carved borders that would later harden into states. The results bundled multiple languages, faiths, and trading networks under new administrations designed for extraction and order, not representation. Ports and railway corridors took priority over hinterland governance, and borders sliced through pastoral routes and markets that had linked regions for centuries. Imperial rule wrapped itself in respectable language. Writers spoke of a civilizing mission, medical campaigns, and the spread of schools, while social Darwinist ideas suggested hierarchy was natural. These frames helped metropolitan voters accept far-flung wars and budget lines for colonial policing. At the same time, imperial displays, jubilees, world's fairs, and naval reviews turned colonies into visible markers of status. A capital measured itself by the size of its flotilla and the length of its telegraph cables as much as by tax receipts. Technology tipped the balance on the ground. The Maxim gun and quick-firing artillery outmatched local forces. Steamships, the Suez route, quinine prophylaxis, and subsea cables compressed distance and time. A governor could send a telegram at noon and receive instructions by evening. A battalion could land within days where a sail-powered convoy once took months. Administrative manuals and standardized legal codes replicated authority across continents with only modest staff. Yet even as the system expanded, quiet resistance grew. Mission schools and new urban jobs produced clerks, teachers, and lawyers who read constitutions and budgets and noticed the gap between slogans and practice. Small societies debated rights in local languages and in English or French. Strikes over wages at docks, petitions against forced labor, and peasant tax revolts signaled that rule required consent, constant coercion. The British Empire reached a point where it governed about a quarter of the world's land and population, proof of reach, but also a burden to supply and defend. Those very engines, industry, national pride, and global connectivity, would become pathways for counterclaims. As railways and newspapers stitched empires together, they also spread ideas that would challenge the entire design. The global war that erupted in 1914 reached far beyond Europe's trenches. Colonial ports buzzed with troop ships, supply depots, and recruiting stations. African carriers marched in supply columns. Indian cavalry rode in France and Mesopotamia. Caribbean labor battalions loaded shells in Atlantic docks. The first shots by British forces came in Togoland, where a small expedition moved to seize a German wireless station. This was a world war because imperial networks made distant regions part of one military system, and colonial subjects found themselves fighting under flags that did not represent their own sovereignty. Many enlisted with expectations. Veterans of earlier campaigns believed service could translate into reform, land rights, or a greater say in government. Religious leaders, local chiefs, and urban elites urged participation, presenting loyalty as a path to status and bargaining power. Over 1.3 million Indian soldiers fought across fronts from Gallipoli to the Western Front, while more than 400,000 African troops joined campaigns in East Africa and beyond. Tens of thousands from the Caribbean and the Pacific joined transport corps, pioneer units, and frontline formations. Their letters, pay slips, and casualty lists traveled home, spreading both pride and grief. The rhetoric of the war clashed with the reality of empire. European states spoke about freedom, consent, and national rights, yet withheld those rights from their colonies. That dissonance did not stay abstract. Soldiers encountered French and British laborers striking for wages, saw elections in wartime parliaments, and returned with questions about why such participation stopped at the colonial boundary. Colonial officers promised reforms to ease recruitment. Many of those promises stalled after the armistice. Economically, the war bled the metropoles. Britain sold overseas assets and borrowed heavily. France mortgaged future revenues and lost industrial regions to occupation. Shipping losses and blockades choked trade. Colonial budgets were retooled to move grain, copper, nitrates, and rubber toward the fronts. In parts of Africa, requisitions and porterage conscription disrupted planting seasons. In India, wartime procurement and price controls warped markets. Shortages and speculation raised food costs. In German East Africa, long guerrilla campaigns pulled in forced labor and devastated local economies. In other regions, epidemics and famine followed as transport and health services strained. These pressures seeded new politics. Demobilized men brought back military discipline, new languages, and awareness of global currents. Associations of ex-servicemen formed around pensions, land claims, and burial honors, quickly becoming hubs for broader grievances about taxes and legal status. Newspapers amplified their voices, tying local demands to the language of rights that Europeans had used to rally their own citizens. Organizers learned how to draft petitions, run meetings, and navigate bureaucracy, often with help from lawyers trained in colonial courts. At the peace talks, the empires recast imperial control under the League's mandate system. Former German territories passed to victors as trusts, with promises of guidance towards self-rule. On the ground, mandatory powers set tariffs, built railways to mines, and policed borders much like before. The new framework carried inspection reports and public filings that nationalists would later cite. Indian troops had fought across the theaters, yet Indian leaders had no seat at Versailles. The contradiction was hard to miss. By 1919, the war had shaken imperial finances and credibility. It left a generation of colonial subjects politically awakened and less willing to accept rule without consent. And it placed new cracks in structures that once seemed permanent. Out of the war came a new promise, a forum to keep the peace. The League of Nations opened its doors in the early 1920s as an experiment in collective security, arbitration, and public diplomacy. Delegates met in Geneva, drafted committees, and set up reporting rules. The architecture looked modern: covenants, sanctions, oversight, designed to prevent a repeat of 1914. For newly mobilized publics, it sounded like a moral upgrade in global politics, a system where disputes moved from trenches to conference tables. But the structure also gave the victors space to reorganize empire. The language of self-determination appeared in speeches, while practical arrangements kept control of strategic coasts, oil regions, and shipping lanes. The mandate system divided former German and Ottoman holdings into categories that implied progress stages, yet the effect on the ground was continuity. Administrations changed flags, not purposes, and officials who knew how to map taxes and build rail spurs kept doing so. Reports to Geneva framed this as guidance toward maturity, and the League's Permanent Mandates Commission reviewed paperwork that rarely altered daily power. Class A mandates, territories like Iraq, Syria, and Palestine, were labeled as nearly ready for independence, with mandatory powers meant to help build institutions quickly. Class B and C mandates in Africa and the Pacific were tagged as less advanced, justifying tighter oversight, customs control, and longer timetables. The categorization mattered because it set expectations about schooling, courts, and assemblies, but it also embedded a hierarchy that mapped closely onto resource interests and strategic needs. Ports, pipelines, and airfields drew more attention than representative councils. Local populations had little say. Petitions reached Geneva, but they faced language barriers, legal filters, and political caution. In the Middle East, new borders and administration styles collided with existing loyalties and land systems. Rural tax burdens, land registration changes, and police practices sparked protests and insurgencies that officials read as security problems rather than constitutional demands. In Africa and the Pacific, labor codes and concession systems channeled workers to plantations and mines under the cover of anti-slavery and public health campaigns. Economic flows kept moving. Cocoa, rubber, copper, phosphates, and palm oil filled ships, while development budgets prioritized extraction corridors. The global body's credibility suffered early. Japan pressed for a racial equality clause during the charter debates and failed, exposing the assumptions that still organized membership and rights. The United States never joined, so the League lacked one of the world's major powers and a source of enforcement. It had no standing army, relied on slow sanctions, and could be ignored by governments willing to gamble. As the 1930s unfolded, aggressive states tested these limits and found few hard stops. Mandate authorities filed regular reports, hosted inspections, and praised improvements in schooling and medicine, but profits and strategic access guided policy. In Palestine, the British Mandate became the framework through which the Balfour Declaration's promise of a Jewish homeland began to take administrative form, laying the groundwork for later conflict in a region already populated and politically active. The League even flirted with social engineering at home. There was a move to discourage war-themed toys for children, an idea that passed with headlines and little effect. A system meant to restrain conquest ended up defending control with humanitarian language, and those contradictions would soon meet crises no committee could manage. The interwar years became a hinge in colonial history. Soldiers and workers returned from the Great War with new expectations, having heard leaders talk about freedom and rights while seeing little of it at home. The League of Nations promised a fairer order, but delivered oversight that resembled older controls. That blend of raised hopes and stalled reforms sparked movements that now spoke in legal terms, used petitions and newspapers, and organized mass actions. Independence shifted from a distant ideal to a concrete demand voiced in crowded halls, union meetings, and student circles across ports and growing cities. In Asia, India set the pace with a model that emphasized public participation. Mahatma Gandhi pushed the non-cooperation movement, which asked people to withdraw from colonial institutions, schools, courts, councils, and build strength through refusal. Volunteers set up local committees, spun cloth as a statement of self-reliance, and coordinated boycotts that hit imports. Police raids, arrests, and bans followed, yet the approach proved that mass civil disobedience could reorganize daily life around a political aim. It taught millions how to mobilize without waiting for elite negotiations to ever change. Further east, French Indochina produced organizers who learned politics from exile. Ho Chi Minh moved between ports and capitals, writing for small papers, meeting unions, and cataloging abuses to international audiences. That network mattered. It showed how a movement could survive domestically tight policing by cultivating allies abroad and spreading literature through student and worker channels. It built patience and a sense of timing that would outlast shifting colonial policies. China's May 4th movement erupted after post-war settlements failed to recognize Chinese interests. Students rallied, merchants closed shops, and new journals attacked both foreign domination and rigid traditions. The wave produced modern schools, vernacular writing, and political societies that treated the public as an engine of change. It legitimized protest as a civic tool and tied national revival to literacy, science, and institutional reform, not only to diplomacy. Across Africa, Pan-Africanism gathered momentum. Thinkers like W.E.B. Du Bois convened congresses that framed colonial grievances as part of a global struggle, while Marcus Garvey's message connected pride, enterprise, and self-rule. Newspapers in Lagos, Accra, and Nairobi echoed those themes, translating diasporic ideas into local debates about land, labor, and representation. Mission schools and new municipal jobs produced lawyers, teachers, and clerks fluent in the language of ordinances and budgets, and they used that fluency to challenge forced labor, unequal pay, and racial codes in courtrooms and councils. The Great Depression then hit the colonial world hard. Commodity prices collapsed. Cocoa, rubber, and cotton growers saw incomes plunge while taxes stayed. Export booms turned to bust, and credit dried up. Urban unemployment swelled. Rural debt deepened. Protests and strikes rose, from dockyards to plantations, as communities pressed for relief. Colonial governments fell back on censorship, emergency laws, and arrests, yet enforcement could not fix prices or restore trade. Culture turned into a political field. Poets, novelists, and editors recentered local histories and languages. Theater groups and reading clubs doubled as meeting places. Associations formed around sports, burial funds, or mutual aid often became training grounds for speakers and organizers. When Gandhi walked 240 miles to make salt in 1930, global coverage carried a clear message about law and legitimacy, and actions inspired by it appeared across the colonial map. In the same decade, Ethiopia and Liberia stood alone as independent African states. Italy's 1935 invasion of Ethiopia jolted opinion, proving that sovereignty without strong backing remained fragile. War returned in 1939, and the imperial machinery switched on. Colonial depots reopened, shipping lanes filled, and recruitment spread throughout towns and villages from Dakar to Delhi. London and Paris called on their empires for manpower and supply, turning local police stations into enlistment posts and warehouses into ordnance stores. Mines ran double shifts, plantations redirected output to military contracts, and workshops retooled for uniforms, radios, and spare parts. A European conflict again became a global war of empires because the empires made every coastline, port, and railway part of one supply chain. The numbers tell the scale. More than 2.5 million Indians served in the Allied war effort across North Africa, the Middle East, and Southeast Asia. Roughly 1 million Africans fought or labored in campaigns from Ethiopia to Burma. Thousands from the Caribbean and the Pacific formed engineering units, air crews, merchant convoys, and pioneer corps. Many fought in brutal, overlooked theaters where disease, terrain, and logistics killed alongside bullets. Letters home described wages and rations, but also unfamiliar front lines and commanders who promised reforms once victory arrived. Those promises collided with an obvious contradiction. Britain and France framed the conflict as a defense of freedom and democracy, while ruling millions who lacked the vote and the right to self-rule. Censorship struggled to keep that gap out of public debate because troops circulated through cities with newspapers, radios, and stories about parliaments meeting in wartime. The dissonance sharpened when Asian forces humiliated European armies. Japan swept through Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, and the Philippines, showing colonized audiences that European garrisons could lose and surrender. Tokyo broadcast Asia for Asians, tying anti-colonial language to its occupation. The message was self-serving and often collapsed into coercion, forced labor, and famine. Yet the frame mattered. Burmese, Indonesian, and Vietnamese nationalists learned how to organize militias, seize radio stations, and write proclamations. When Allied offensives returned, they found movements that had gained experience under both collaboration and resistance, and leaders who knew how to leverage a power vacuum. Wartime conditions reshaped economies. Colonial governments rationed food, fixed prices, and commandeered transport. Local industries expanded as imports fell. Mechanics fabricated parts, and small foundries cast shells and rails. Black markets flourished where controls pinched too hard. Currency shortages, inflation, and supply bottlenecks eroded administrative authority, and smuggling networks cut across colonial borders that once seemed firm. Police could raid warehouses, but they could not conjure shipping tonnage or stabilize exchange rates. Across the Atlantic, a new variable emerged. In 1941, the Atlantic Charter set out principles that included self-determination. Activists in Asia and Africa read the language plainly and cited it in petitions and speeches. British leaders downplayed its reach, insisting it applied to occupied Europe, but the phrasing had already traveled. In meetings and leaflets, the charter became a reference point that tied local demands to the Allied war cause. A single event captured the psychological rupture. Singapore fell in 1942 after a rapid advance that exposed weak defenses and brittle planning. The collapse ended the aura of invulnerability that propped up imperial authority in much of Asia. The Burma campaign that followed assembled soldiers from over 40 nations, Nepali Gurkhas, African infantry, Chinese formations, and more, fighting along mountain tracks and river valleys in one of the war's most diverse coalitions. In Malaya, Japanese bicycle infantry advanced fast on narrow roads, a low-cost tactic that stunned defenders who expected armor. Wartime leadership minted nationalist figures. Subhas Chandra Bose raised forces to challenge British rule from the east. Sukarno built networks that would declare independence when Japan surrendered. North and West African veterans returned with training, contacts, and leverage. By 1945, Europe was exhausted and indebted, its prestige punctured, and its colonies newly organized. The war had bankrupted imperial centers, armed their subjects with skills and arguments, and tilted the world toward independence. The old order now faced momentum it could not reverse. India had long been the asset emperors bragged about, a vast market, a supplier of cotton, tea, and jute, and the key link in imperial shipping. By 1947, same territory became the point where Britain's post-war limits were laid bare. The Raj could no longer balance debt, troops, and legitimacy. The war had strained the treasury, disrupted trade, and accelerated the growth of a political public that refused to step back into pre-war obedience. India emerged as the first major colony to exit after 1945, and its exit made the imperial blueprint look outdated. The shift did not happen suddenly. Decades of organizing built the foundation. Mahatma Gandhi's campaigns trained millions to resist without rifles, boycotts that hurt imports, strikes that halted rail lines, and marches that made laws look enforceable only at gunpoint. Jawaharlal Nehru carried the parliamentary and diplomatic edge, translating mass pressure into institutional demands and statecraft. Together, they turned protest into a national habit and made rule by decree look unsustainable. Local Congress committees ran relief, arbitration, and schooling, showing that an alternative administration was possible when colonial officials stalled or jailed leaders. During World War II, the contradiction sharpened. Britain drew heavily on Indian manpower and resources while refusing a clear path to freedom. The Quit India movement in 1942 declared that cooperation expired. Arrests swept leadership ranks, censorship tightened, emergency laws widened. Yet unrest spread across districts anyway: strikes, sabotage of transport, and parallel committees. Wartime scarcity deepened anger, inflation eroded wages, and procurement targets pushed grain out of local markets. By 1945, the Raj faced a population that had learned mass action and a state apparatus that struggled to provision itself. Underneath the independence drive, a second argument hardened. The Indian National Congress pressed for a single, secular state with protections for minorities and a strong center. The Muslim League, led by Muhammad Ali Jinnah, argued that Muslims required a sovereign homeland to secure political rights. Colonial policies had long encouraged separate electorates and communal counting, and those habits shaped negotiations. Each riot, boycott, or election tally became proof of one side's winnings. Talks produced plans and counterplans, but each draft faltered on trust and the balance of provincial powers. Exhaustion guided London's calendar. A firm withdrawal date arrived faster than administrators could resolve boundaries, police arrangements, or property questions. Sir Cyril Radcliffe, a British lawyer who had never visited India, received weeks to draw lines through Punjab and Bengal. His commission pored over district maps, railways, irrigation canals, and demographic data, then issued an award that would only be published after independence ceremonies. Partition created India and Pakistan. The border cut across markets and neighborhoods. It set off one of history's largest migrations. Around 15 million people moved, and communal killings took more than 1 million lives. Trains arrived with survivors and bodies. Columns of refugees stretched for miles. Freedom carried a split mood. Crowds filled streets for flag raisings and oath-takings, while families packed what they could and fled. Administrators had to build ministries, courts, and armies as they tried to stop violence and feed displaced people. Yet that transfer of power delivered a global signal. Independence arrived through sustained mass politics, not a decisive battlefield victory, and movements in Asia and Africa took note. Gandhi held no office, but his approach became a manual for future leaders in other continents who would adapt protest into negotiation leverage. Nehru spoke at midnight on August 15, 1947, as radio sets carried the moment worldwide. The borders drawn that month still shape South Asia's calculations, and the trauma that followed independence continues to inform security, elections, and diplomacy. India's exit showed that the costs of holding empire could outrun the benefits. India's midnight transfer of power set off a quick recalculation in London. The treasury was stretched, troops were thin, and holding distant territories no longer looked affordable or necessary. Within months, the British moved to settle other colonial files in South and Southeast Asia. The process did not follow a single script. Each territory had its own politics, leaders, and timelines, yet the pace shared one driver. Post-war weakness made rapid exits practical, even when political maps were unfinished. Start with Pakistan in 1947. Created by partition as a sovereign state defined around a new Muslim-majority claim. The new government had little infrastructure of its own, and few administrative reserves. Ministries assembled in temporary offices, and records, seals, and stationery arrived piecemeal. At independence, Pakistan's government had to borrow typewriters, desks, and even paper clips from India, a snapshot of how hurried the handover was. Muhammad Ali Jinnah stepped in as Governor General and the central figure of authority. He set the tone for a state balancing provincial interests with an urgent need for a working center. His death in 1948 removed the most credible arbiter just as the country faced its first security and fiscal tests. The first crisis came as people moved in fear, haste. Millions crossed the new border along rail lines and roads, a flow that strained food stocks, housing, and policing. The armies of India and Pakistan separated assets and personnel while trying to steady districts torn by violence. In Kashmir, a princely ruler's indecision and local uprisings turned into a shooting war that drew in regular forces before the first anniversary of independence. The state also had to bridge a continental gap between West and East Pakistan, split by 1,000 miles of Indian territory and cultural divergence that would grow into the 1971 break. Next came Burma, independent in January 1948 after occupation, resistance, and negotiation. Wartime upheaval had trained a generation of activists and soldiers, and the countryside held more arms than the colonial era ever allowed. Aung San, the most prominent independence leader, negotiated the path out, but was assassinated months before freedom. His absence left a weak civilian core facing ethnic demands, communist insurgencies, and economic dislocation. The new government inherited a rail and port network geared to export rice and teak, yet it lacked the administrative reach to stabilize border regions. Within a short span, the military gained influence as the only institution able to coordinate force and logistics across the fractured landscape. Ceylon, later Sri Lanka, took a different route. In February 1948, it became independent through a set of negotiated steps that preserved parliamentary routines and civil service continuity. Many colonial-era officials stayed on under local ministers, which reduced early shocks to budgets and public services. Voter rolls expanded under a new constitution, and cabinet politics focused on trade, plantations, and exchange controls. Beneath that smooth surface, however, the political system placed the Sinhalese majority in a position to define language and education policy, while Tamil communities watched for safeguards that rarely matched expectations. The seeds of later dispute lay in these early choices about citizenship and representation. These three paths showed the range of exits from empire. Pakistan wrestled with the costs of sudden statehood and a frontier war. Burma faced a leadership vacuum and the pull of armed politics in a diverse state. Ceylon managed continuity but embedded tensions in its institutions. Each had to build bureaucracies, secure borders, and finance development without the Imperial center's credit and naval protection. For Britain, speed looked like strategy. Quick transfers cut defense spending and limited liabilities. The result became both a signal and a caution. Independence was clear and fast, yet cohesion and stability would take far longer. Victory in 1945 left Britain and France stretched thin. Armies were victorious, but treasuries groaned, and voters at home wanted housing, food, and jobs more than distant garrisons. The Middle East, rich in oil and fed up with foreign officers, turned into a test the empires could not pass. Bases, treaty rights, and special advisors remained in capitals from Cairo to Baghdad, but every year after the war made them harder to defend diplomatically and financially. The region had already been reorganized once, and that earlier redesign carried its own fuse. After World War I, the Ottoman collapse opened space for mandates that handed real power to London and Paris. Iraq, Palestine, and Transjordan fell into the British sphere. Syria and Lebanon went to France. These administrations drew borders, issued currency, and trained local forces while keeping control over airfields, customs, and strategic roads. By the 1930s, assemblies and cabinets existed on paper, yet serious decisions still depended on mandatory signatures. Grievances stacked up, land registration that shifted ownership, tax systems that funded police before schools, and concession deals that wrapped resources in long contracts. The promise of tutelage felt like a delay tactic. After 1945, a younger generation turned those grievances into a platform. Arab nationalism tied dignity to control over armies, oil, and foreign policy. Veterans who had served in wartime logistics knew how depots ran and how quickly supplies could be cut. Students formed parties, newspapers rallied support, and strikes hit ports and rail lines that the mandates had built. The language of sovereignty hardened, and the cost of propping up old arrangements rose with every protest met by troops. Iraq reached formal independence in 1932, but British leverage remained strong for 2 decades. Air bases, training missions, and advisory roles kept London central to defense planning. Oil concessions secured steady supplies for British refiners, and pipeline routes bound the economy to Imperial shipping. Even so, nationalist pressure pushed governments to rework terms, and by the 1950s, the balance of influence had shifted from dictates to negotiations backed by mass politics. In the French zone, Syria and Lebanon moved to full independence by the late 1940s, pushed by street protests, strikes, and outside mediation. French attempts to reassert control after the war had hardened local parties and an international mood that frowned on old-style occupations. Embassies replaced residencies, and French troops sailed home, but the security forces and economies they left behind still bore the imprint of Mandate-era priorities. Palestine became the flashpoint. Years of friction between Zionist and Arab communities, British white papers, and irregular violence ended with London handing the file to the United Nations. British withdrawal in 1948 coincided with the declaration of Israel and a regional war that redrew lines and created a refugee crisis that would define politics for generations. The departure itself carried a small symbol. British authorities shut off the lights in Jerusalem and left quietly by sea. The power vacuum pulled surrounding states in and shoved the question into every neighboring cabinet. Egypt brought the coming climax into focus. Though independent since 1922, British troops still guarded the Suez Canal zone, a corridor that cut costs for Imperial shipping and linked bases east of Aden to the Mediterranean. Nationalist anger swelled around that footprint, and a young officer, Gamal Abdel Nasser, rose with a promise to end it. Oil now magnified every decision. Western industries and militaries depended on Middle Eastern petroleum, pipelines, and ports, giving local leaders new bargaining power. Money, not just flags, set the timeline. The next collision, over a canal and a bond market, would show how little prestige could buy by 1956. The war ended, but the uniforms came home to second-class status. African veterans who had guarded depots, driven convoys, and fought in Ethiopia and Burma stepped off trains to find passbooks still required, chiefs still sidelined, and councils still advisory. European capitals had relied on African labor and cash crops to feed their armies. They now argued the continent was not ready for political power. That gap between wartime need and peacetime denial turned into a grievance no censorship office could fully contain. Markets reopened, inflation bit into wages, and barracks discipline migrated into unions and associations that met after shifts in rail yards and ports. The rhetoric of freedom was fresh in people's heads. The Atlantic Charter of 1941 circulated in pamphlets and sermons, quoted by teachers and catechists who treated self-determination as a promise, not a slogan for Europe alone. The United Nations Charter in 1945 reinforced that language, providing legal phrases that petition writers copied into letters to governors and to new UN committees. Activists mapped local issues, forced labor, hut taxes, discriminatory pay, onto a broader claim to self-rule. Colonial officials tried to narrow the meaning, but the words traveled faster than memos, and they gave organizers a shared vocabulary across borders. Cities became training grounds. In the Gold Coast, Nigeria, and Kenya, railwaymen, dock workers, and miners formed unions that negotiated wages and hours, while also teaching members how to vote in meetings, keep accounts, and draft demands. Boycotts of imported goods hit colonial revenues and merchant profits. Newspapers with small print runs carried arguments from one port to another, turning local strikes into continental stories. In French West Africa, elected deputies pressed for reforms in the new French Union, linking the ballot box to autonomy claims. Names moved to the front. Kwame Nkrumah returned to the Gold Coast with a simple, urgent line, "Self-government now," and built a party machine that reached into markets, lorry parks, and cocoa villages. In Kenya, Jomo Kenyatta argued for land rights and civic equality, translating rural grievances into a constitutional program. In Abidjan and Dakar, Félix Houphouët-Boigny used legislative seats to chip away at forced labor and push for new status inside the French system. Their methods differed, but their calendars aligned: mass meetings on weekends, petitions timed to legislative sessions, and legal challenges that forced administrators to answer in public. Pan-Africanism shifted from conferences to organizing. Diaspora intellectuals had long framed the problem. Now, trade unionists, teachers, and clerks tied that frame to daily struggles. The Fifth Pan-African Congress in Manchester in 1945 brought together future heads of government and campaigners who compared tactics and set priorities. That meeting planted contacts that would later route money, printing presses, and legal help to hotspots across the map. Colonial governments tried to manage the surge with controlled councils, restricted franchises, and technical development plans. New constitutions added nominated seats. Development authorities promised roads, clinics, and soil conservation. But the tempo had changed. People learned to hold mass rallies without permits, to switch from street protest to courtroom filings, and to turn commodity leverage into political leverage. Gold Coast cocoa farmers, squeezed by fixed wartime prices, refused to pick beans after the war until conditions improved, proving that the export economy could be a pressure point. Culture joined tactics. Poets and editors reclaimed local languages for public debate. School teachers assigned histories that centered African kingdoms and trade routes. Theater troupes staged plays about chiefs, clerks, and courtrooms. Minds shifted before maps did. By 1957, networks that began as scattered protests had become national machines, and one coastal colony stood ready to convert momentum into a flag. Ghana would make the announcement for the continent. Gamal Abdel Nasser stepped onto the podium in July 1956 and announced that Egypt would nationalize the Suez Canal. The waterway had long served British and French shareholders and stood as the shortcut that underwrote their sea routes to Asia and East Africa. For London, it was more than a ditch. It was a guarantee that tankers, troop ships, and cargo could move without a costly detour around the Cape. Even after Egypt's nominal independence in 1922, British troops remained in the Canal Zone to guard that artery and the bases that made it work. Nasser moved after months of stalled development deals and a sense that Egypt's sovereignty remained conditional. Taking the canal placed tolls, pilots, and signaling under Cairo's control and funded domestic projects that had waited on foreign loans. It also reversed the pattern where strategic assets sat behind treaties written abroad. In Arab capitals, the move read as a declaration that decisions about ports and pipelines would no longer be made in European boardrooms. At home, engineers and administrators replaced foreign managers overnight and kept traffic moving, signaling competence along with defiance. Britain and France saw a dangerous precedent. If Egypt could seize the canal and face no penalty, other states might target oil fields, pipelines, or air bases. Paris linked the move to its war in Algeria, reading Nasser's broadcasts and diplomacy as support for insurgents. Israel, shut out of the canal and facing cross-border raids and blockade pressures, saw an opening to weaken a hostile neighbor. The three governments formed a plan. Israel would strike across Sinai, Britain and France would issue an ultimatum, then intervene to separate forces and secure the canal. The military phase unfolded quickly. Israeli forces crossed the desert with armor and paratroopers. Anglo-French aircraft hit Egyptian airfields, and naval units approached Port Said. On the ground, Egyptian units resisted, but the imbalance in air power showed. Port facilities took damage, and canal operations stalled. The plan assumed that a short, sharp campaign would unseat Nasser and restore outside management, but the international reaction cut in from a different angle. Washington and Moscow, rivals on nearly every other issue, condemned the intervention. The United States pressed financial levers, signaling that it would not support sterling in currency markets and pushing action at the United Nations. The Soviet Union issued threats and backed diplomatic moves to halt the attack. Under market pressure and diplomatic isolation, Britain and France accepted a ceasefire and a UN force deployed to the canal's approaches. No battlefield defeat had forced the retreat. The cost of continuing without global backing did. The consequences were immediate. Nasser held office, the canal stayed Egyptian, and broadcasts across the region credited him with outmaneuvering two formal imperial powers. In Algiers and beyond, militants and politicians drew a lesson about leverage, coordination, and patience. Newly independent states read Suez as proof that colonial prestige could not withstand financial pressure and world opinion. The Cold War deepened the shift. Washington and Moscow now competed to fund dams, arms, and roads, courting governments that had once been expected to obey. Television carried the crisis live, turning the loss of imperial initiative into real-time spectacle. By the year's end, 1956 stood as the moment when Britain and France lost the ability to act as imperial arbiters. Independence movements accelerated, and leaders understood that control without credit would not hold. On March 6, 1957, the Gold Coast became Ghana. The handover in Accra marked the first sub-Saharan African colony to reach independence in the post-war era, and it did so through a method that organizers across the continent had studied for a decade: sustained pressure, legal maneuvering, and electoral legitimacy. The calendar mattered. Elections produced mandates, strikes pushed negotiations, and a transfer agreement turned into a ceremony that signaled a new baseline for what was possible. Kwame Nkrumah stood at the center of that story. He had moved from student circles and diaspora networks to organizing at home, then built a machine capable of turning street energy into votes and budgets. His line about taking the political kingdom first distilled a priority: control the state, then use it to shape education, industry, and continental ties. The Convention People's Party, formed after a break with more cautious nationalists, learned to work the ground. Ward organizers logged supporters, lorry drivers carried pamphlets up country, and lawyers prepared challenges to restrictive ordinances so that each arrest or ban produced a fresh court test. Independence did not arrive as a surprise. It followed years of boycotts and labor actions that linked cocoa markets to politics. When producers refused to move beans at fixed prices, they forced talks about how revenue and risk should be shared. Urban unions in dock and rail yards ran disciplined stoppages that drew attention without burning the infrastructure they would need later. By the mid-1950s, the CPP had shown it could win elections, manage municipalities, and operate a press that reached villages and schools. Radios relayed speeches to areas beyond newspaper routes, and rallies stitched farmers, traders, and students into one audience. The choice of name signaled intent. Adopting Ghana, drawn from an older West African empire, anchored the new state in a regional past of trade and governance, not in a colonial timeline that began at a European treaty. Flags and an anthem designed by local talent replaced imperial insignia with symbols that could be taught in classrooms and worn on sports fields. The message was practical as well as proud. Institutions would be staffed and supplied locally, and culture would be part of state building, not an afterthought. The world took notice. Delegations arrived from African territories, independent states, and diaspora communities. The guest list included figures who saw the moment as part of their own campaigns for rights, and church bells in Harlem and fireworks in Lagos underscored how far the signal traveled. Coverage spread throughout newspapers and radio services that had followed earlier crises. This time, the headline was a transfer completed without a civil war. For organizers in Lagos, Nairobi, and Brazzaville, the lesson was clear. Mass politics could convert into sovereignty on a timetable shorter than the empires had claimed. Nkrumah's next steps aimed beyond the coastline. A united Africa, he argued, would have the same scale to finance development, negotiate mineral contracts, and avoid trading one dependency for another. He pushed regional bodies, scholarships, and conferences that tied student unions and ministries together. The pressures were real. Prices still swung with global commodity markets. Capital goods had to be imported, and opposition parties tested the limits of a fast centralizing state. Yet the headline held. Ghana's independence set a pace. Within a decade, most of the continent moved, and the phrase "winds of change" matched the numbers on new flags and UN seats. Maps changed color almost weekly in the early 1960s. From West Africa to the Horn, parliaments opened, flags rose, and embassies filled credentials in capitals that had never hosted them before. Textbooks fell behind the pace. Each new edition needed another chapter for a country that had not yet existed in the year prior. Radio services added languages, airlines added routes, and school children learned new anthems by heart. This was Africa's Great Awakening, independence moving so quickly that officials struggled to print stamps fast enough for the post. Even London said the tide had turned. In 1960, British Prime Minister Harold Macmillan stood in South Africa and told his hosts that the wind of change was blowing through the continent, a rare admission that the age of empire was ending on a schedule Britain no longer controlled. In the same year, the calendar confirmed it. 17 states took their seats: Nigeria, Senegal, Madagascar, Congo, Somalia, and many others, crowding the front pages and forcing foreign ministries to redraw briefing books. The United Nations built new nameplates at a rate that redefined its debates and voting bloc. Why did the wave crest then? Europe was still paying the bill for 2 world wars. Debts, rationing memories, and rebuilding costs made garrisons and colonial civil services hard to justify. Nationalist parties had matured, with branches in markets, mines, and schools that could turn rallies into elections and petitions into constitutional talks. Pan-African links, student networks, union ties, and press exchanges moved strategies across borders faster than governors could respond. And the Cold War offered leverage. Washington and Moscow competed with loans, scholarships, and arms deals, each hoping that a new flag would align with their camp, which made independence a realistic bargaining position. Paths to freedom diverged. Negotiations produced orderly transfers in places like Nigeria and, soon after, Tanganyika and Zanzibar's union as Tanzania, where electoral timetables and civil service continuity eased the break. Elsewhere, violence defined the transition. Algeria's war against French rule mobilized villages, prisons, and diaspora support. In Kenya, detention camps and emergency laws tried to crush insurgency, while land grievances drove recruitment. The Congo moved from midnight celebration to mutiny and secession within weeks, as a fragile state inherited few trained officers and faced foreign mercenaries and mining interests. France adjusted with a strategy that preserved reach. Under a banner of France-Afrique, Paris granted legal sovereignty while maintaining tight economic and political ties. Currency zones, defense accords, and elite networks that kept contracts and policy influence close to home. The arrangement avoided colonial labels without surrendering key levers, and it showed how empire could shed uniforms but keep boardrooms. The mood on the ground was electric. New leaders promised schools, clinics, and roads. Flags drew on Pan-African colors, and anthems written by teachers or civil servants replaced imperial tunes at parades. Yet the map carried old scars. Borders drawn in chancelleries split ethnic groups and glued rivals together. Armies built for colonial policing struggled with national defense and politics. Coups followed, sometimes backed by outside powers guarding minerals, ports, or air corridors. Commodity swings kept budgets hostage to cocoa, copper, or groundnuts, and loans arrived with conditions that steered policy from abroad. Membership in the United Nations accelerated the shift. Dozens of new votes changed committees, resolutions, and the language of international law. Anti-colonial questions moved from leaflets to microphones, and sanctions, recognition battles, and peacekeeping missions reflected a less Eurocentric order. Between 1957 and 1965, the roster of independent African states jumped from 1 to over 30, the fastest political transformation on record. The symbols adapted too. Many flags began as modified versions of colonial designs with the foreign emblem removed. Cameroon's move to green, red, and yellow became a template others echoed. The wind carried far beyond the continent. Soon the Caribbean, the Pacific, and parts of Asia followed, drawing on the same mix of grassroots organizing, diplomatic leverage, and the simple fact that the cost of holding on had finally outrun the benefit. Japan's surrender in 1945 didn't bring quiet to Southeast Asia. It brought a scramble. Imperial police vanished, arsenals opened, and leaders who had organized underground during occupation stepped into daylight. Across the region, committees, neighborhood militias, and returning exiles claimed authority before the old colonial flags could be raised again. The vacuum was brief but decisive. It allowed ideas, national independence, social reform, and non-alignment to gain institutions, slogans, and armed supporters. In Vietnam, Ho Chi Minh proclaimed a new republic in Hanoi in September 1945, invoking principles that resonated globally. French forces re-entered, backed by Allied arrangements that treated Indochina's liberation as a return to the status quo. Talks failed fast. By late 1946, firefights in Haiphong and Hanoi hardened into the First Indochina War, a grinding contest of outposts, supply lines, and political will. The Viet Minh built parallel governance in liberated zones, collected taxes and rice, and stitched together a lean logistics network through jungle corridors and highland trails. French command relied on fortified bases, airborne mobility, confident that firepower could pin down a peasant army. Dien Bien Phu overturned that calculus. In 1954, French planners airlifted a garrison into a remote valley near the Laotian border to draw the Viet Minh into a decisive battle. Instead, Vietnamese engineers carved roads out of forest, camouflaged gun pits into hillsides, and hauled artillery piece by piece to encircle the camp. Weeks of rain, trench lines creeping forward, and targeted counter-battery fire collapsed French positions. The defeat triggered political crisis in Paris and opened the door to negotiation. At Geneva, the great powers and Vietnamese delegates accepted a temporary line at the 17th parallel. The North consolidated under Ho Chi Minh's movement. The South formed with foreign backing and a mandate to build new institutions quickly. National elections were discussed, timetables sketched, and supervision assigned to an international commission. On the ground, families split, cadres relocated, and rival security services dug in. What looked like a pause already contained the next conflict. Washington read the divide through the lens of containment. Advisors, funds, and equipment flowed south. In the countryside, land policies, village defense programs, and intelligence networks collided with insurgent organizing. By the early 1960s, the war expanded from ambushes and sabotage to major offensives, strategic hamlets, and sustained bombing campaigns. Urban protests, draft resistance abroad, and televised combat turned Vietnam into a global argument about power, ideology, and the meaning of self-determinism. In 1975, after years of attrition and shifting alliances, Saigon fell, and a unified Vietnam emerged at staggering human cost. Around Vietnam, other struggles set the regional pattern. In Indonesia, Sukarno declared independence in 1945 and faced Dutch attempts to restore control. Diplomacy, guerrilla warfare, and international pressure, especially at the United Nations, forced Dutch recognition by 1949, even as Indonesia wrestled with federalist revolts and the task of uniting a vast archipelago. Burma achieved independence in 1948 and immediately confronted insurgencies by ethnic armies and communist factions, pushing the state toward militarization. In Malaya, the emergency pitted British forces and local authorities against a communist-led guerrilla movement from 1948 to 1960, blending counterinsurgency, resettlement, and political reform to undercut rebel support. The region became a workshop where nationalist programs met socialist experiments and superpower rivalry. Colonial-era borders bundled dozens of languages, faiths, and histories into new states, leaving disputes over autonomy and land that outlived the flags. Yet the drive for sovereignty gave coherence to otherwise fragmented politics. The Viet Minh once moved supplies on bicycles over hundreds of miles and dragged heavy guns through mud and mountains to ring Dien Bien Phu. Its original recording misplaced for years before resurfacing in 1950. By the time the Vietnam conflict reached its end, it stood as the emblem of the decolonization age, proof that even overwhelming force could not erase a determined claim to nationhood. Compared to the battlefields of Asia and Africa, the Caribbean and Pacific moved through quieter corridors, talks in colonial offices, constitutional conferences, and referendums. The pace could be slow, but the direction was steady. Local councils expanded, universal suffrage spread, and civil services trained teachers, nurses, and clerks who later staffed cabinets and parliaments. Trade unions pressed for better wages and rights, and those negotiations matured into political parties led by lawyers, journalists, and historians who knew both the language of empire and the leverage of organized voters. In the British, French, and Dutch Caribbean, education reforms and labor strikes in the 1930s and 1940s had already reshaped expectations. Wartime service and migration to Britain and North America produced a politically aware generation with networks abroad and ambitions at home. London responded with staged constitutions, executive councils with more elected members, ministerial responsibility, and finally, talks about the timetable for independence. Yet island economies remain tied to sugar, bauxite, and tourism. That dependence made planners cautious and kept debates focused on viability as much as sovereignty. The boldest attempt to settle the viability question came with the British West Indies Federation from 1958 to 1962. It aimed to pool revenues and institutions across the Antilles, from Jamaica to Trinidad, under a shared federal parliament. Within 4 years, it collapsed. Voters and elites split over customs unions, capital location, and how much authority the federal center should hold. The end of the Federation revealed hard realities. Each territory had different export bases, migration patterns, and political cultures, and many preferred direct paths to nationhood over a complex regional compromise. Independence followed a clear sequence. In 1962, Jamaica and Trinidad and Tobago led, each negotiating terms that kept the British monarch as head of state while transferring control over defense, foreign policy, and finance. Barbados took its turn in 1966, followed by the Bahamas in 1973 and Grenada in 1974. Belize, long delayed by a border dispute with Guatemala and worries about defense, completed the process in 1981. Some territories chose to remain linked. Several stayed in the Commonwealth realms, adopted associate state status, or maintained close defense and monetary ties. Others, including Puerto Rico under the United States and New Caledonia under France, retained arrangements of autonomy that mixed local self-government with metropolitan oversight. Across the Pacific, scattered archipelagos navigated similar compromises. Western Samoa became independent in 1962, with a constitution blending local chiefly authority and parliamentary rule. The decade closed with Fiji in 1970, then a major leap with Papua New Guinea in 1975, where an administrative handover had to bridge hundreds of languages and remote highland communities. The Solomon Islands followed in 1978. For Micronesia, the Marshall Islands, and Palau, compacts of free association balanced internal self-rule with external defense guarantees and financial support. These agreements recognized that oceanic distances and small populations required flexible sovereignty. Culture shaped politics at every step. Caribbean states fused African heritage, European legal frameworks, and Creole languages into national identities that reached from the classroom to the cabinet. Pacific nations codified customary land tenure, respected chiefly titles, and translated them into modern constitutions. Small economies posed constant tests. Tourism swung with recessions. Storms and commodity prices could set back annual budgets. Aid and remittances steadied the gaps while leaders pushed for diversified services, offshore finance, and regional cooperation. When Barbados became independent in 1966, celebrations featured a calypso program and fireworks made from surplus naval flares. These island traditions mapped another route to freedom: negotiated independence, constitutional redesign, and flags raised without gunfire, yet with budgets and treaties that kept old ties in new forms. While new flags rose across the continent, the South remained locked in white minority rule, and that stalemate turned the region into the toughest frontier of decolonization. South Africa sat at the center. It had self-governing status since 1910, yet power stayed with a white electorate. In 1948, the National Party formalized apartheid, a legal system that mapped race onto every aspect of life: residence, marriage, schooling, voting, even which city center bench a person could use. Pass laws, forced removals, and the creation of homelands kept black majorities without real rights, while the economy relied on their labor in mines, farms, and factories. Tension broke into global view at Sharpeville in March 1960. Demonstrators gathered to challenge pass laws. Police opened fire, killing 69 and wounding many more as crowds fled. The state declared emergencies, banned organizations, and expanded security powers. Movements that had grounded their strategy in protest reconsidered their options. Underground networks formed, training camps opened beyond the borders, and exile politics grew legs in African capitals and London. South Africa became both a domestic police state and a foreign policy problem for anyone doing business with it. Leaders emerged with distinct roles. Nelson Mandela, a key figure in the African National Congress, moved from courtroom campaigns to organizing sabotage cells and seeking support abroad before his arrest and long imprisonment. Oliver Tambo built an international coalition from exile, turning church groups, student unions, and trade unions into a pressure machine. Desmond Tutu added a moral voice that carried into parliaments and pulpits, framing sanctions as a duty rather than a gesture. Inside the country, Steve Biko's Black Consciousness movement challenged internalized racism and fostered community organization. His death in police custody in 1977 amplified outrage far beyond South Africa's borders. White dominance was regional, not just national. To the north, Rhodesia's white regime declared unilateral independence in 1965 and fought insurgents for years. To the east, Portugal held Angola and Mozambique until the mid-1970s. Liberation movements turned the map into overlapping guerrilla theaters. In Mozambique, a protracted war exhausted Portugal. In Angola, multiple movements battled Lisbon and each other, drawing in foreign backers. Those victories in 1974 and 1975 broke a key pillar of the regional system and opened new rear bases for fighters targeting South Africa and Rhodesia. The Zimbabwean struggle escalated as guerrillas pressed the Smith government, leading to a negotiated settlement and independence in 1980. Namibia remained under South African control despite international rulings, and fighting continued until a settlement cleared the way for independence in 1990. Throughout, frontline states, Zambia, Tanzania, Botswana, Mozambique, and later Zimbabwe, absorbed refugees, hosted camps, and coordinated diplomacy despite cross-border raids and economic retaliation. International solidarity deepened the isolation of apartheid. The United Nations adopted sanctions and arms embargoes. Universities and cities endorsed divestment. Sports boycotts turned stadiums into stages for politics. Banks tightened credit, companies exited, and the cost of defending the status quo climbed. The endgame moved quickly once it began. In 1990, Mandela walked free after 27 years. Talks opened with banned organizations unbanned and political prisoners released. 4 years later, South Africans voted together for the first time, and a new government took office after a negotiated transition. On Robben Island, prisoners had built a secret university teaching law, politics, and languages behind bars. At the inauguration, the Air Force flew planes once used against insurgents, now in tribute to a democratic order they could not defeat. The struggle in southern Africa closed the colonial era's hardest chapter and set a standard for persistence backed by broad alliances. As colonial flags came down, the map split along another line, Washington and Moscow. Each claimed a model for order, growth, and security, and each saw the new states as the arena where those claims would be tested. Loans, arms, advisors, broadcast stations, and scholarships became levers. The contest ran through ministries and barracks as much as it did through jungles and deserts. New governments faced choices shaped by budgets and neighbors. Accept an aid package, and you might adopt its strings, voting patterns at the UN, basing rights, or a development plan that tied your currency to an external lender. Reject it, and you might lose access to markets or credit. Leaders balanced agriculture versus industry, military spending versus schools, and the urgency of borders still under dispute. The pull came from both directions. Capital flows from the West, and security guarantees or revolutionary training from the East. Many refused the binary. In 1955, delegates met in Bandung, Indonesia, and sketched a path that did not require a patron. That meeting seeded the non-aligned movement, and by the 1960s, it gave post-colonial states a forum to coordinate votes, share technical expertise, and back each other against economic pressure. The Bandung spirit meant Afro-Asian solidarity, non-interference, and recognition that colonial rule could return through debt, bases, or covert action rather than formal annexation. Superpower rivalry still shaped outcomes. The United States backed anti-communist partners even when their elections stalled or their prisons filled. The Soviet Union armed and funded revolutions, offered industrial plans, and broadcast a message of anti-imperial fraternity. Both courted military officers and student leaders. Both subsidized newspapers and radio. Both paired aid with memoranda that mapped the recipients' future steel mills, highways, and voting preferences. Flashpoints showed how fragile sovereignty could be. In the Congo after 1960, the state unraveled under mutinies, secession, and the assassination of a prime minister. UN troops deployed, foreign agents arrived, and the crisis hardened into a template for Cold War intervention. In 1959, Cuba's revolution declared a break with dependency, and soon aligned with Moscow, inspiring movements from Central America to Southern Africa and provoking embargoes and covert campaigns. In Angola after 1975, liberation factions turned their rivalry into a civil war with foreign troops, airlifts, and advisors crowding the battlefield. The conflict stretched for decades and tied regional politics to distant capitals. At the United Nations, numbers changed the conversation. Dozens of new members formed a third world bloc that pushed resolutions on decolonization, disarmament, and a fairer global economy. Votes condemned apartheid, defended sovereignty, and demanded a new international economic order that recognized commodity shocks and the leverage of resource producers. The Assembly became a place where small states could trade support across issues and extract concessions their GDPs alone could not secure. Decolonization also unfolded in schools, studios, and courts. Curricula moved from imperial chronicles to national history. Governments elevated local languages and reformed civil codes. Film, literature, and visual art rejected borrowed standards and recentered indigenous aesthetics and memory. These choices mattered. A language policy affected literacy rates and budgets. A publishing law determined who told the nation's story. The Bandung Conference gathered 29 countries, representing over half the world's population, with no Western powers invited. The term Third World echoed the Third Estate, a claim that the majority could shape global rules. In this climate, independence meant navigating survival, keeping borders intact, debts payable, and choices credible, while neutrality itself could be the boldest stand. By the 1970s, Portugal stood alone in Europe, still fighting to keep major colonies. Lisbon treated Angola, Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau not as distant holdings, but as extensions of the metropole, a claim written into law as overseas provinces. That framing locked Portugal into defending territories larger than itself with a small economy, a conscript army, and a dictatorship unwilling to concede that the imperial age had passed. Under Antonio de Oliveira Salazar and later Marcelo Caetano, the state censored dissent, centralized decision-making, and poured scarce resources into garrisons thousands of miles from Lisbon. War began in 1961 and never paused. The Portuguese colonial war opened on 3 fronts at once and stretched supply lines from the Atlantic to the Indian Ocean. Conscripts rotated through bush camps and border patrols, while officers refined counterinsurgency doctrine, special forces, aerial reconnaissance, and village control programs designed to separate fighters from civilians. The costs climbed each year: higher taxes, emigration of young professionals, and a growing sense that Lisbon's strategy had no finish line. Angola became the most complex front. Rival nationalist movements, the MPLA with Marxist leanings, the FNLA with roots in the north, and UNITA drawing support in the Central Highlands, fought both Portugal and each other while seeking international backing. Battles cut off roads, threatened plantations, and pushed thousands into towns under military protection. In Mozambique, Frelimo, led by Samora Machel after early leadership losses, built sanctuaries near the Tanzanian border, trained cadres, and moved steadily south from remote zones, using small units to strike posts and withdraw before reinforcements arrived. In Guinea-Bissau, Amilcar Cabral structured a disciplined movement that ran liberated areas with schools, clinics, and courts, making the war a political project as much as a military one. Cold War currents ran through every trench. Cuba, China, and USSR supplied training, weapons, and advisors to liberation groups. South Africa, some Western partners offered Portugal intelligence, logistics, and quiet support against factions they viewed as communist. Each shipment tilted local balances and deepened the sense in Lisbon that defeat would carry geopolitical consequences beyond colonial loss. The strain broke first inside Portugal's own barracks. Junior officers, repeatedly deployed to a war without a clear end, organized a reformist movement. In April 1974, they executed the Carnation Revolution, a coordinated military coup that toppled the regime with minimal violence and halted the colonial campaigns. Civilians placed red carnations in rifle barrels as soldiers occupied key buildings, and the symbol stuck because it captured a transition driven by uniforms but affirmed by streets. The political shift forced immediate decisions. Guinea-Bissau moved to recognized independence in 1974. In 1975, Mozambique and Angola followed, as Portuguese officials handed ministries to movements that had fought them the week before. Yet both newly independent giants fell into civil wars fed by outside money, arms, and ambition. Angola's factions drew in Cuban troops and South African incursions. Mozambique's Renamo insurgency, backed from abroad, targeted infrastructure and rural administration, undoing gains Frelimo had claimed during the anti-colonial struggle. Within roughly a year, Portugal's overseas empire ended, closing a chain begun in 1415 with the seizure of Ceuta and stretching to Angola's independence in 1975. It was the longest continuous colonial project on record. The Carnation Revolution also entered a short list of revolutions where no shots were fired, and flower sellers became unlikely protagonists because their stock turned into emblems of consent. The fall of the Portuguese Empire marked the last collapse of an old world structure, and it cleared space for new conflicts over sovereignty, ideology, and resources that would define the region's next decades. By the late 20th century, most colonies had gone, but a few strategic holdouts still mattered. Hong Kong and Macau stood at the edge of China under European flags. Scattered Pacific islands remained in loose arrangements that blurred the line between dependency and autonomy. These places carried oversized weight because they linked trade routes, currencies, and migration networks built during empire to a world that was now reorganizing under global markets and multilateral rules. Hong Kong sat at the center of that shift. Britain's crown colony in Asia had grown into a financial engine with container ports, banks, and a manufacturing belt that fed global supply chains. Its success rested on a mix of common law, free ports, and a hard-working migrant society that arrived in waves across the 20th century. Yet the island's political status traced back to gunboat diplomacy. After the First Opium War, the Treaty of Nanking ceded Hong Kong Island to Britain. Later conflicts added Kowloon and the new territories on a 99-year lease, setting a timer that would force decisions before the century closed. Over decades, the city turned a 19th century prize into a 20th century platform. Factories moved from textiles to electronics, then to logistics and finance, while the harbor stacked steel boxes that tied East Asian export booms to Western consumers. The city ran on a light-touch colonial administration that prized stability, contract enforcement, and open capital accounts, even as demands for representation grew. That contradiction, economic modernity under an unelected executive, set the stage for negotiations once the lease end date neared. In 1984, London and Beijing signed the Sino-British Joint Declaration. It laid out a path for a 1997 transfer under one country, two systems, promising that Hong Kong would keep its laws, currency, and way of life for 50 years. The deal reflected leverage on both sides. Britain knew the new territory's lease expiry would undermine its hold. China saw the city's financial role as an asset for reform. Preparations followed. A basic law drafted the post-1997 order, institutions rehearsed new arrangements, and residents weighed whether to stay, invest, or emigrate. The Handovers symbolism ran ahead of the paperwork. At midnight on July 1, 1997, rain poured over a farewell ceremony where Prince Charles spoke as the Union Jack lowered for the last time over a major British colony. Locals read the storm as the heavens weeping. Hours later, the city opened for business under a new flag, and the practical tests began. How to balance autonomy with the sovereign's interests while markets watched every headline. 2 years later, Macau followed a parallel route. Portugal completed its own long imperial retreat with a 1999 handover to China, also under one country, two systems. It closed 5 centuries of European footholds along the Pearl River Delta and confirmed that Asia's coastal gateways now belong to regional powers shaped by growth. Zooming out, other transitions signaled the near finish line. Belize reached independence in 1981 despite a territorial dispute. Brunei did so in 1984 with hydrocarbon wealth in reserve. Namibia's 1990 independence ended South Africa's mandate and marked the last large African decolonization. The common thread was a move from direct rule to independence. Treaties, currency boards, offshore finance, and trade law replacing garrisons. Chris Patten's departure on the Royal Yacht Britannia to the tune of Auld Lang Syne captured the final voyage mood. The empire's pageantry exited the harbor as derivatives, shipping schedules, and central bank swaps took center stage, and colonial history gave way to globalization. Empires faded, yet new links multiplied. Trade routes stayed, legal systems traveled, and alumni of imperial schools turned into ministers, judges, and economists who kept speaking to London, Ottawa, Canberra, and beyond. Airlines, news agencies, and scholarship programs stitched these relationships into a loose architecture that survived the formal lowering of flags. The paradox of the post-empire world was that exit often produced more conversation. From that reality grew the Commonwealth of Nations in 1949, a voluntary club that converted the hierarchy of empire into an association. Membership did not grant orders. It enabled meetings, technical exchanges, and development grants that moved teachers, agronomists, and election observers across continents. Shared language and legal habits made cooperation simpler, and a rotating summit rhythm set an expectation that leaders would face one another regularly rather than through distant embassies. Inside the association, large and small states pushed to redefine the balance. Leaders from India and Ghana pressed for equal standing, aid policies with transparency, and a voice for new members whose economies had been shaped by colonial trade patterns. The British monarchy shifted with the model, recasting itself as a symbolic link rather than a command center, and turned royal tours into soft diplomacy that emphasized service projects, schools, and health initiatives. The platform mattered because it amplified smaller capitals. A Caribbean island or a Pacific state could raise concerns about tariffs, maritime rights, or election integrity and find partners willing to coordinate training or observe polls. Education ministries swapped curricula and exam standards. Health ministers pooled procurement for vaccines, and lawyers debated human rights charters that later surfaced in national constitutions. Boycotts and suspensions gave the group a lever when members strayed from core commitments, and sports sometimes carried the message louder than communiques. Beyond this circle, regions built their own frameworks. In Africa, the Organization of African Unity launched in 1963 to defend borders, mediate disputes, and support liberation causes. Southeast Asia's ASEAN began in 1967 with a focus on stability, consultation, and gradual economic integration. The Caribbean formed CARICOM in 1973 to coordinate customs, travel, and shared institutions like a court and a single market project. Each alliance blended practical needs, ports, energy, and migration with the political aim of speaking together in a crowded international system. Economics drove the toughest debates. Commodity price swings, debt shocks, and reliance on former metropoles for credit or markets fueled charges of neocolonialism, suggesting that control had shifted from governors to bankers. Terms of trade, structural adjustment, and exchange rate regimes turned cabinet meetings into seminars on global finance. In response, a louder collective voice emerged through the non-aligned movement and the G77 at the UN, where developing states demanded better representation, technology transfers, and a new international economic order. Cultural work advanced alongside budgets and treaties. Schools elevated local languages and narratives. Publishers backed writers who challenged inherited frames, and national broadcasters produced archives that centered indigenous memory. The Commonwealth's soft power lived here too, from coordinated pressure against apartheid to cooperative events like the Commonwealth Games, which gave small nations stages to present themselves as equals. By 2000, more than a third of humanity lived in Commonwealth countries, an illustration of how a coercive empire had morphed into a network by consent. The word Commonwealth, once tied to older power visions, had come to mean something closer to parity. The post-empire world settled into a dense web of continuity and change, where treaties, courts, and culture reworked old ties into modern connections that could support or strain the new order. By the 20th century, the maps looked different, but the old lines still shaped lives. Empires had faded as legal entities, yet their borders, treaties, and economic blueprints kept steering decisions. You can see it in how parliaments debate language policy, how ports handle exports, and how schoolbooks describe national beginnings. Decolonization did not stop at a flag change. It moved into courtrooms, classrooms, and balance sheets, where people argued over fairness, memory, and who holds the pen. Post-colonial states inherited boundaries that bundled rivals together and split communities apart. Those lines often ran through deserts and forests with no regard for trade routes or kinship. When disputes reignited, governments faced the choice of negotiation, autonomy arrangements, or force. Economies carried another legacy. Colonial systems had been built to extract raw materials and ship them out. That design left weak manufacturing bases, narrow tax revenues, and dependence on a few commodities. Fixing it required industrial policy, regional trade, and patient institution building. Yet the global market rewarded speed, not long-term reconstruction. Meanwhile, law codes and administrative habits, civil services, court hierarchies, and exam systems mirrored former rulers and took time to reform without losing capacity. A new front opened around ideas. Universities, museums, and cultural institutions began reassessing collections and catalogs. Researchers and curators tracked provenance, identified how pieces left their communities, and drafted agreements for return or reproduction. Syllabi expanded beyond imperial narratives to include local archives, oral histories, and languages that had been sidelined. The work spread to public space. Monuments and building names came under review, and citizens asked who was honored and why. In 2015, the Rhodes Must Fall movement in South Africa and the UK forced a wider debate about authority over space, curriculum, and historical interpretation. Economic power adapted rather than disappeared. Multinational corporations set terms through supply chains, taxes through transfer pricing, and standards through contracts. Lending combined with policy conditions shaped budgets and cut or expanded social programs. Trade regimes and intellectual property rules decided who could make medicine, process minerals, or build a digital platform. Many labeled these patterns neo-colonialism because they replaced soldiers with spreadsheets while producing similar dependencies. Debt restructurings, commodity slumps, and sudden capital flight made sovereignty feel contingent on investor sentiment. Culture moved in the other direction, spreading from the global south into the mainstream. African cinema earned new audiences, novels reshaped classrooms, and visual artists reframed how museums tell stories. Indigenous communities revived languages, opened immersion schools, and codified land rights. Diaspora networks built new identities in global cities, mixing food, music, politics into coalitions that link neighborhoods to home countries and to international campaigns. Power also rebalanced. India, China, and Brazil advanced as lenders, builders, and security partners. Their state banks financed ports and railways. Their companies bought mines and farms. Their diplomats mediated crises. Sometimes these relationships helped diversify options. Sometimes they reproduced old asymmetries in new forms, with access to resources traded for infrastructure and policy space narrowed by contracts. Despite progress, unresolved colonial legacies remain. The Chagos Islands dispute, Puerto Rico's status debates, and calls for Caribbean reparations keep the past present in law and diplomacy. More than 60 million people still live in non-self-governing territories called overseas territories or dependencies. And the process keeps evolving. In 2021, Barbados became a republic, replacing the British monarch as head of state decades after independence. A reminder that political forms often change in stages. The story of decolonization reshaped the world, and it's still unfolding today. Subscribe to learn more about history that still matters.